All right. We're going to talk about shifting left. We're going to talk about testing on APIs and virtualizing. So we call ourselves the continuous testing company. The reason for that is we believe that we have to be able to test as fast as we can develop and deploy. Because if you cannot do that, that means that either you're not going to test enough or you're not going to test good enough, right? Or you're going to test for the green, basically, because you want to make sure that you get your deadline. The only way that you're ever going to achieve very high rates of automation is if you're capable to test as much as you can on APIs and virtualize those systems that you are dependent on. So this is key in achieving really high automation rates, because if you do everything on the UI, it basically takes too long. Another problem with the UI is it usually is available at the end of the sprint. Right? So you cannot test until the very last moment. And that is really dangerous, because that means that it takes some time for you to even realize what needs to change at the very last moment. You can't do that. So APIs are available from the beginning. Right? That's the first thing that gets developed in a cycle. So if we can start testing here at this phase, that means that you can already create your definitions, your data combinations and everything before the UI becomes available. And that means obviously a ginormous increase in efficiency. Okay, so we've already established that creating scripts for test cases is not really the way to go, right? We believe that we have a great solution by creating modules. That way it's business readable and less technical people can actually create scripts, meaning you can utilize more people to actually get stuff done. The thing is that we also do that for APIs. And that is pretty cool, because that means that once you have a handoff from a technical guy to your testers, everyone can create API tests. And thus you can really shift left, because that is the biggest issue with testing on APIs. It is too technical for most of the testing team. So what we do is we create test cases that are always business readable, whether they are API on the right or UI on the left, right? So the only real difference there is between an API test case and a UI test case is obviously the field names. We don't have drop downs in an API, right? So that's basically the only difference that we have between those two. And then we have another issue. Your network and your environment is not clean. It's not just your system under test. I wish that were the case. We always talk about our system under test. But your system under test is unfortunately talking to a host of other systems that you do not have any control over. And that means that if some break, some are under maintenance, some are being upgraded, that you cannot test your system under test. Not because you're not ready, no, because the rest of the environment is not ready. And that is a real problem. So what is the solution to that? Service virtualization. We can create those on the fly. We can create those based on WSDLs. We can create those based on APIs. We can create those basically at the moment that they come out. And that means that you can increase the speed of everything tenfold. So how does that work? We are basically the man in the middle. So we are capable of sniffing out information, and we are capable of sending information when required. We can do that in a failover situation, but we can also do that in proactive state where something hasn't been created yet. So let's show that, shall we? So here we have a nice clean sheet of Tosca, and we're going to fill that with API test cases. We're going to create an API test case. We're going to create an OSV scenario. We're going to create two OSV scenarios, one based on an API and the other one based on sniffing the surrounding environment. Now, I'm sure that you're already familiar with our great application. If someone says no, I'm really going to laugh, to be honest. And this thingamajig. What you can see here are the services that this application talks to. And I can turn on and off those services so that I can actually show you live what happens if a service fails. Right? So that way you have a general understanding of the environment. And now let's get cracking. If we go into the application and we're going to take, in this case, the insurant, the person. Right? There is an API that actually is a CRM service and will provide the information of a certain individual based on first name and last name. So I am in that system, and I can remember my own name, thank God. So if I type myself in, then I'm fed the information, my address, and so forth, right? It's a very simple API call. To be able to do a test on that, we have a separate API scanner. And the reason this is separated and not incorporated into the tool is that this is freeware. This is something you can hand out to your developers. And because you can hand it out to your developers, there's no Tosca licenses required to be able to create your API test cases. Again, utilizing as many people as you can at the moment that it's necessary. So, in this case, we are going to scan that live service, right? And said in the beginning, you can also do this with files. WSDLs, Swagger, you know, whatever is necessary. And the reason that is there is, I've already said that as well, is you can virtualize it immediately from here. And that is really, you know, a very fast way of working. So let's connect to that URI. So the only thing I need to do is basically copy this service URI, paste it in here, and then we see the RR pair, right? So this is the challenge, first name, last name, and I'm going to fill in my details, and then I'm expecting the same behavior that we saw on the website. So we're going to send that to that service, and you can see here that a call is being made to that service, and here you can see the reply, right? So it works the same as we expected as what we saw on the UI level. This, however, is quite technical, right? So this can be intimidating to a lot of people to work with. So what can we do with this? We're first going to import this as an API test case. And in the beginning, there's not a lot of improvement. It's still XML. And how do we now transform this into something we can hand off to less technical people or even business people? Two ways we can do that. First is we're going to select that portion of the code that we want to transform into controls. And we simply say add. And here we have a perfect correlation between a readable context and the code. The other way to do this is simply go onto the component level folder. Click on the plus thingamajig, and what you get is all the possible controls that we can extract from the code that has been seen there. And this is really fast because I can now simply do stupid things and close everything down. I can now simply select everything, add them as controls in Tosca. And I'm afraid that I did something really bad here. There we go. And now what you see here is that all the controls have been created automatically, right? Based on that pull down information. Not only that, you get a test case where everything is already pre-created as well. And this is really saving time. The other thing is that we already put in the last RR pairs in terms of values. And that means that you already know what the syntax is of something. So if you need to create a data sheet based on that information, because obviously first name, last name we can think up, it's not an issue. But imagine if you have all sorts of weird numbers, ratios, whatever addresses that you cannot really understand. Here is where you get the grammar. You can drag the grammar to your red section, create a table around this, right? Okay, so that's one thing we can do. The other thing we can do, and I've said that as well, is we can use this API call and import it not as an API test, but directly as an OSV scenario. And what I will do is I will create my modules just the same way as I would any other test case. In this case, I'm just going to select the stuff in the text itself. And I can transform my scenario. So I could use the values as they have already been used in this case, right? So I could use my first name and last name and all the other information that feeds back. The other thing that I can do is use wildcards. And this means you have flexibility. You can actually decide what it is that you're testing, right? Because sometimes you just don't care whether it's my name or someone else's name, as long as you do get the reply that is necessary to continue your process. And this way, you're absolutely sure that you define how your narrative exactly is. Then lastly, this is a service that we can virtualize. And in terms of time, I would really like to invite you for a more expanded demo at the booth. There's one more thing that I want to show you. If you have an environment that you want to emulate, it's usually quite a lot of work to be able to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to set it up back to the basics, and we're going to have a look at our service virtualization environment, which really works as kind of a proxy server, a man in the middle, right? So it decides where traffic goes, why, and when. And what we can do now is we can record all traffic. So if I start a recorder, go back into Tosca, run a test case, and by the way, you could also do this manually, right? I mean, it's just because I'm a lazy guy, I don't want to type everything, but it's basically getting the process flow. And what happens on the background is all the calls that are being made to that service are being logged as RR pairs. And these RR pairs we can later use into our test cases. So here we go. We're going back into our OSV, and here we see all that information. We can stop the recording now. And the first thing that we're going to do is turn off the services that we have been using, right? So we're going to turn off the car service, we're going to turn off the CRM service, turn off the rating service and the order service. And that means that it's no longer a functional website. So if I take this one, pull this down, there's nothing there, probably will give me an error. You know, it's not functioning anymore. So what we can do is import this into a new folder. And let me just create a new folder real quick. Go to the OSV and say imported recorded stateful. And the stateful part is quite important because that means that I get the data combinatories with the actual flow. I don't just get the RR pairs. So we're going to collect those messages. Do you want to create pattern matching? Yes, please, because I don't want to think. And here you get the flow and all the calls that have been made. And this is very useful not just for creating scenarios, but also for bug fixing. Because if you see a double call for something, you already know why something is not functioning the way that you expect it to. This scenario is ready to deploy. So I don't have to do anything. The only thing I have to do is say, okay, deploy this scenario. And we are ready to run the same test case, even though you've seen the website doesn't function anymore. So as opposed to using the live services, it will now rely on the OSV in the background to make sure that you have your process completely under control. And this is really important because that means that regardless of the complexity of your environment, if you have a process and you sniff out every single part of communication, you can build a virtualized reality around that. And that means your system under test is always in a stable situation and you are in control of the data that goes through there because everything can be hooked up to data sheets, right? I would really like to invite you to my booth. The API testing is right over there, and then I will give you a more in-depth demo on API and OSV if that's required. For now, thank you so much.